Friends, thank you very much for joining us once again. It's great to have you with us. James, nice to see you.
Very good to see you, Ian, too. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, me too. Now, before we plunge into this fascinating passage that we're looking at, we normally remind people to do three things, don't we?
We do very much remind them, and we love people to like our videos. We love you to subscribe to the channel, and we'd love it if you shared the videos on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, or wherever you normally spend your time.
Yeah, quite. Well, yeah, just not around the house, so it needs to be sort of beyond that. Right?
Indeed.
But now, James, there's actually a fourth thing that I think I'd like to suggest people do as well,
Right.
which is to make a comment.
Yeah.
Not many people comment. It is very interesting. People on social media generally, there's quite a high threshold of confidence for commenting.
Yeah.
But friends, if there's something you spotted that you thought, oh, I haven't heard of that before, or that was interesting, or I made use of that, then make a comment below. That'd be great. And we
Yeah.
can have a
Yeah.
little
It's
bit of
always.
discussion.
And when we do get comments, they're always fantastically interesting, I think. So people, it's a real contribution, isn't it? So we gain from it, and
We
that's
do.
great. Yeah.
And we'll have an avalanche of comments this week, no doubt.
Yeah, won't be able to reply to them all.
Now, James, we are in the third Sunday before
Advent.
Advent in year C, are we not? So
We
what is our
are.
reading?
Yeah, and so we've got this reading Luke 20:27 to 38, which is a little bit strange because it's one of these things where the lectionary seems to have cut us off in our prime a bit. And
We're always moaning about that, aren't we?
we are, but really, they really ought to do better because even in most Bibles, I think the paragraph ends at the end of verse 40, and so it's very much part of the passage. So you might want to vary that.
Yeah, quite. But by the way, folks, for those of you who are devotees of my mug discipline, this is my evening coffee mug. Okay. So,
Yeah, very important. Yeah.
good to have that. I'm sure as people watch, they're sitting drinking coffee or doing whatever.
I'm sure they do.
Yeah. Okay, so the passage, Luke 20:34. Now, James, I'm going to need your particular help today. The reason is I've looked at this passage in quite some depth, and I did some time ago, and I wrote an article which included a study of it, and that's what I've included in the blog post. And I think my feeling is that this is actually quite a difficult text for us to do our normal thing and just sort of talk through and do the exegetical stuff, because it is quite short, and it seems to me it's very theological.
It's very dense theologically, yeah, and you can't engage with this passage really without engaging theologically. And of course, that's really the point of it, in the sense that the Sadducees come to Jesus and they ask him a profoundly theological question. And I think it's fascinating, really, that Jesus seems to love engaging with this question. He's not at all reticent. He doesn't sort of dismiss it or give a sort of quick answer or anything. He very much gives them an in-depth answer. And that's really interesting, because one of the things that, I'm sure Ian, and I know in my own ministry, is that sometimes people do, say to you things like, "Oh, well, it's not the finer points of theology aren't really important. All we've got to do is love one another, and then that's." And actually, that's really very, very dismissive of the real questions that actually we need to address as human beings, and which many of us actually have. People want detailed answers to significant and serious questions, and I find it immensely reassuring that Jesus takes the time to engage with a question that the Sadducees, who are essentially opposed to his views, or as it turns out,
Yes.
he's really happy to engage with them, and that's a really important lesson for all of us. That not only should we ask those difficult questions, but we should engage with them when people ask them.
He does engage them, but he engages them by telling them they're completely mistaken, of course.
He does, and he's not at all reticent about that. And interestingly, he comes down on one side of the argument. It's the Sadducees versus the Pharisees, essentially, and he comes down on the side of the Pharisees. So that's also very significant.
Well, I think that's also interesting in relation to our previous discussions about the way Pharisees are portrayed negatively, that actually Jesus is here articulating at one level a typical sort of Pharisaic answer to the question. So.
Yeah, and of course that is consistent also with Paul's view of this whole subject of resurrection and the life of this age and the age to come, which we'll get into in a moment.
We will, and of course we'll again see some connections between Luke's articulation of Jesus' discussion and Paul's theology. But we need to start with my joke about the Sadducees.
Oh yeah, go on. I know.
They didn't
Everybody
believe.
knows it.
They did. Oh, do they? I don't know. Have you all put a comment in below? Did you know? Do you know this joke? The Sadducees don't believe in life after death. That's why they're sad. You see?
Yeah.
Hey, bodum.
That's out of a book. I first read that in a cartoon book. Is it Simon Jenkins?
Oh, could well be. Yes, it is.
Bible
Yeah,
from Scratch, I think it's called.
that was amazing. That's a classic. That's a long going back a long time.
It is a long one, but it's still very, very funny.
It is. It is. I love it. Okay. But now I don't know off the top of my head if the previous conflict is covered in the lectionary at all, but this is part of a series of conflicts with Jesus when he's in Jerusalem,
Yes.
in the Temple Mount area. And again, the reason why it's worth including the final verse is that in verse 40 they no longer dare to ask him any questions. So it's actually quite an important, and actually, although Luke's account of this interaction has got some quite significant differences from Matthew and Mark, they all agree on the fact that this kind of draws a line, and after this no one asks him any more questions, and as Jesus, as it were, goes on the front foot in terms of asking them questions and proposing.
And it seems to me that, I mean, these questions are clearly designed to embarrass Jesus in front of the crowds and make him look a bit silly. And he, of course, he relentlessly answers them brilliantly. And so, it feels like this story, they think, okay, all right, we're going to give up now because we realise that we're not going to achieve the goal, because the goal is not to get the question answered most of the time. It's really
catch
to
Jesus out.
Catch Jesus out.
Yeah. And of course, Jesus does what I always fail to do, which is he remembers the best answer at the time, whereas I always flounder around.
Yes.
And then I go away and they mull about it and think, oh no, I know what I should have said.
I think it's the universal human experience. Apart from Jesus, it always seems to nail it.
Although, of course, you never know how often these conversations happen. So
No, and so often, these questions must have come up multiple times, just as Jesus told parables many times to answer similar questions. So,
do we need to explore any more of the Sadducees? I mean, this is the only time they're mentioned in Luke's Gospel. They do come up in Acts a couple of times. But of course, we don't hear much about them, unlike the Pharisees, because they are the they're mostly priestly, but they're also the sort of elite.
Yes.
The ruling elite in Jerusalem, but because they're primarily attached to the temple, they believe in the Torah, but not the oral law, against the difference between them and the Pharisees, and therefore they believe that what happened, that the dead go down to Sheol. They don't believe in the resurrection. But with the destruction, because they're attached to the temple and to political power. Once in the Jewish War of 66 to 70. When the Romans defeat the Jews and then destroy the temple, that's kind of the end of them. And I don't think we even hear much of them in Jewish history subsequently.
No, I don't think you do. But this whole, I mean, they are the political thing is very interesting, isn't it? Because they are attached to political power. Within the structure of the Roman.
I just wondered whether there was, for us, any connection there between, what happens when you have political power and you lose faith in the hope of the resurrection. I
don't know. Yeah, maybe that's something people could explore in a sermon.
Okay. So the example then they use. So they are, they do sort of, as it were, pose this question to Jesus. But of course, it's a reductum ad absurdum. They're assuming there's the resurrection of the dead, which they don't believe in. In other words, they're trying to prove that Jesus' own belief in resurrection, along with the Pharisees, is just foolish and illogical.
Yes.
And they use this example of Levirate marriage. Now, one thing I did notice in the commentaries, I think is quite interesting, is that the purpose of Levirate marriage in Deuteronomy wasn't just about the perpetuation of someone's name afterwards. It was also about provision for the widow and so on. But of course, they stripped that down. And of course, what they're wanting to say is, look, if in Levirate marriage this woman has successfully married these people, in the resurrection, whose wife is she? So in other words, they're saying, if you assume there is a resurrection of the dead, then you get an impossible contradiction. Therefore, there can't be the resurrection of the dead.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because they, clearly the question is predicated around the idea that the purpose of marriage in Genesis is to go forth and multiply, to be fruitful and multiply. So children are a vital component within that belief system, that understanding. And that's really challenging, I think, for us in our culture today, isn't it? Because the purpose of marriage is often not articulated like that at all, and yet that is what Christians believe. That is mainstream Christian belief, I would say.
Well, it is, and it's in the Church of England
It is in the
marriage
Church of
decency.
England Introduction to Marriage. Yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah,
is. I was at a wedding yesterday, and I also
ah,
conducted a wedding. I don't, unlike you, because I'm not based in I'm not, my ministry isn't based in a parish. I don't conduct that many weddings, but I did do one this summer, and I, I'm always struck, and I don't know why I've been noticing more recently. Perhaps it's because the questions are floating around that yes, this is the place for nurture children. This place of building community. I've been struck really afresh by the way that the preface to the marriage service, which talks the introduction rather, begin with the service with,
mm,
which describes what marriage is all about, is actually quite multifaceted and quite integrated. But also both that and the sort of vows as well. I mean, they don't pull any punches about the fact that marriage is about sex and it's bodily and it's about bodily union and that's
yeah.
all sort of jolly good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, but it's incredibly affirming of all of that, and of course this passage is really interesting because, as we'll get into,
Yeah,
there is that whole question about is that something that is taken forward into the life of the age to come, into the resurrection life,
yeah,
or is it something
yeah.
simply for this life only?
Yeah, indeed. Now, just going into Jesus's answer, again, one of the things that's very striking about it is he talks about, well, depending on your translation, the sons of this age and the sons of the resurrection,
Yeah.
which again, there's no doubt that that must mean the sons must mean sons and daughters
Yes.
because
Yeah.
women are
Yeah.
included in
Children.
that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and because the woman is the subject of the question. So Jesus here is also very clearly articulating this language of eschatology in the sense of this age and the age to come,
Yeah.
which we all know from reading our Tom Wright, which is over there somewhere,
Yeah.
and other things, and reading my Grove booklet. I should have put that up on the thing, shouldn't I? My Grove
Yeah.
booklet on eschatology.
Mm.
So that classic Jewish view that this evil age will come to an end at some point, God's
Yeah.
Messiah will come, the dead will be raised, the oppressors of Israel will be kicked out, Israel itself will be purged.
Yes.
So Jesus's cleansing of the temple was an eschatological sign,
Yes.
and the dead will be raised, and,
Yeah.
and the new age will begin.
Yeah. Yeah.
But of course, in Jesus's life, death, ministry, and resurrection, that was only partially realised. That seems
Yeah.
to be a pretty important background for us to make sense of this whole thing.
Yeah, and it seems to me that what Jesus does here is he draws a very clear, well, he does two things really, which of course are articulated in the stories of his own resurrection. Is that he draws a very clear distinction between what life looks like in this age and in the age to come. So in terms of Jesus' own resurrection, I mean, he is able to pass through walls and doors without opening them apparently.
Yeah.
But there's also a continuity as well, and I suppose that's there's Jesus himself shows the marks of the nails in his body.
Yes.
So he's physically similar, and yet the body is able to do things which it couldn't do before his death and resurrection. So there's continuity and discontinuity, and the question really is, what are the bits that remain?
Discontinuous, yes.
Yeah, what's discontinuous? It seems to me that Jesus focuses particularly on the discontinuity in this passage at one level, and then of course the theological questions that we have around this are, which I think you raised on the blog, are well, what are the continuous bits as well? Because we kind of need to know that, and once we do work that out, we begin to understand this age more clearly in what we're doing in terms of sex and children and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So I think it's I think it's very helpful. I mean, and a huge theological weight rests on it, really.
Yeah, it does. Again, very interesting. He uses this phrase that those who attain the resurrection of the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage.
Yes.
Which
yes.
again, in that context, is talking about those who are married are men and those who are given in marriage are women.
Yes.
So I was fascinated that I was reading Ben Witherington's commentary on the parallel passage in Mark. He's written a commentary on this on Mark. Actually, might have written on Luke as well, but I don't think I've got that. But it was interesting that he suggested that this is specifically on the question of continuity and discontinuity. He suggested that marriages in this age would persist into the resurrection age, but there would be no new marriages in the resurrection age.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Yeah.
Well, I find that entirely unconvincing.
Yeah.
Because surely when Jesus says they will neither marry nor be giving in marriage, he's not particularly talking about betrothal ceremonies. He's simply talking about the whole thing about marriage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if he wasn't, he wouldn't actually be giving the Sadducees an answer, because the Sadducees'
Yeah.
answer isn't about future marriage in the age to come. It's about the
No.
status of existing marriages in this age and whether they persist into the age to come.
Yeah, it sounds, I have to say, I mean, I shouldn't really say this, but it sounds a bit like a kind of pastoral sop to somebody who's, who's worried about the life of the age to come, and they won't be married to their partner, that there'll be something that is different about that relationship. Whereas actually, I think the point of this passage is our relationships will be so much more than,
Yes.
but with all of God's people. And actually we and I think once again you make the point in the blog that we need to lift up our eyes and not think about what we're going to lose in the resurrection, but actually what we're going to gain in the resurrection with the whole family of God as Jesus reconstitutes it in the kingdom.
Now, let me on that point. I think I need to jump ahead here, because from a theological point of view, and say, well, what is it that we gain, and what is it that we lose, and what's the relationship between the two? And I quote a little bit from the article that I wrote in this book on marriage, family, and relationships, and the notes are there in the article. But later on in the article, I cite an example by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, I think, gives an illustration, and he says it's a little bit like trying to explain to a small child what the importance of sexual union and intimacy is like in a marriage relationship when they've got no experience of it. And of course, you could say to the little boy, well, what's your most delightful experience? What's the thing you love most, that's most wonderful? And he says, eating chocolate.
Yeah.
And then you say, well, okay, for in marriage, sexual intimacy is like that. It's like sort of the best thing, as it were, the most fullest expression of your life together. And the little boy says, so do you then also eat chocolate at the same time? And the answer is no, because you don't need to. And then the boy goes away with the end of the day saying, oh gosh, what sex involves not eating chocolate? I mean, that doesn't sound very good to me. and the reason why I think it's quite a good illustration is because I don't think it's a coincidence. And this is why, I mean, I hate to step into this now when we're talking about this reading, but this is why, one of the reasons why the whole debate in the Church of England about marriage is such a big theological issue, and not, as it were, merely pastoral pragmatics. I don't want to be dismissive about it, but the reason is that it seems to me that part of the language we find in Revelation 19, 20, 21 is that we have in the New Jerusalem intimate union with God, and the language that's used to describe that is marriage.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the reason why marriage between individuals doesn't persist is because there's something even better.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is this intimate union with God, which is even better than the intimate union that people experience in the marriage relationship.
Yeah.
But of course, like the little boy, he goes away saying, oh, you mean you don't eat chocolate? We go away saying, oh, so we're not going to be married. How disappointing.
Yeah. And, at one level, at a practical level, it's understandable, because as human beings in this age, the greatest intimacy that you would know is in the marriage relationship, isn't it? By definition, really. Yeah. So that's it. It is a. But you're absolutely. I think it is a. Yeah, I agree. I think it's a difficult one by way of analogy, as it were. Yeah.
Now, just coming on to the continuity and discontinuity, again, in the article, I just sort of set out what it seems to me to be 5 issues that we need to understand from what Jesus says here. So, first question is, in the age to come, will we have bodies? That is our destiny bodily resurrection?
Yeah.
And the answer is absolutely clearly yes.
Yeah, it has to be. And hopefully we all preach that every Easter morning.
And if we don't, we need to read Tom Wright or My Grove Booklet or anything.
Yeah. I mean, I've got Tom's book here. If anybody isn't familiar with it, it's a lot of words, but it is fantastically, and it's fantastically dippable into. So
it is. And I would also say it's readable. It's very
Very
readable.
readable.
So
Yeah,
you
it's
can
very, very
actually
readable.
get through. Even though it's a big book, you can actually get through it quite
Yeah,
quickly.
yeah, yeah.
But I think the other emphasis here, which comes out of this text, and it comes out of Luke's version as well, is the fact that Jesus describes us as sons or children of the resurrection. In other words,
Yeah.
it is bodily resurrection. Whenever we see the word resurrection, we must remember that in Jewish context, it's bodily
Can only mean bodily. Yeah,
resurrection. I
yeah,
do have a little allusion again on the article to some of the debates amongst the fathers about exactly what those bodies were like, but it is bodily. And again, just coming back to this ambiguity about the description of Jesus, it's interesting that in the resurrection accounts, there are times when people don't immediately recognize who Jesus is. So Mary is a bit
yes,
tilted in the garden in John 20
yeah,
and on the Emmaus Road in Luke 24. And yet there are other times where they clearly do. So in the episode in John 21 by the lake, when Peter says it's the Lord.
yeah, yeah.
So he recognizes him.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the first question. The second question is, if we have bodies, will those bodies have the marks of sex difference? That is, in the resurrection, will we be male and female?
Yeah.
Now, I sometimes say to people, you might not have thought of this before, but when Jesus was raised from the dead, did he still have a willy? People find that a slightly unusual question to ask. But because to be human is to be sexed, to be
Yes.
male or female,
Yeah.
I think the answer there is also yes.
I think it has to be because our identity is profoundly bound up with our sexed bodies, isn't it? We would not know who we are without them any more than if I know the shape of my arm or I know the look of my face in the mirror. That those things are part of who I am, and those who who suffer an injury or something that profoundly affects that. So it must be really important.
I wonder whether we're going to unleash a torrent of comments on this video.
we
Start
might
getting
be.
into these questions. My third question is, if we have bodies which are sex differentiated, will we be engaged in sexual intercourse? That is, will our sexual organs have any utility? This is where we begin to... Oh, by the way, this is the crossover from the question of what does it mean to be like the angels? Because some people say, well, no, we won't have sex bodies because we'll be like the angels. But, as people say, just because something's like something doesn't mean that everything carries over. So in some ways, like the angels. And the answer seems to be here, no, because for two reasons. The theological reason is that our ultimate intimacy now is the intimacy in the presence of God.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Intimacy with God, and presumably also intimacy in some way with one another, because we are part of the reconstituted family, the family of God in God's kingdom.
Yeah.
Which Jesus relentlessly reconstitutes throughout the Gospels, and so we in a normal family there is an intimacy between brother and sister and parent and aunt or all that. There's a particular knowing of one another, which doesn't have a sexual dimension, but it is actually really important. So presumably there's something going on there in the resurrected family.
And I think this is really, really, really critical because it's, again, another thing to keep coming back to is that one of the primary metaphors for what it means to be in Christ and to belong to one another is that familial language. We are brothers and sisters. And we see this again all the way through. It's this Paul's language. He addresses the believers as brothers, Adelphoi brothers and sisters all the time. Jesus, when he's challenged about, your mother and brothers and sisters are outside in Matthew 12, he said, well, who are my mother, my brothers and sisters? Those who do the will of God.
Yeah.
But this again leads on to the question, if we have bodies with sexual organs, will have a use, will it lead to procreation? Definitely not. So again, I cite a number of people who say, that where there is death, there is marriage because there's procreation, but actually in the resurrection, sons of the resurrection, children of the resurrection, then there is no death. Therefore, there is no need for procreation. Therefore, there's no need for marriage and intercourse.
No, exactly, because those things have passed away, as it were.
Yeah. And there's another absolutely crucial, it seems to me, element here in Jesus' theologizing, which speaks directly into some of the challenges we're facing within the debate in the Church of England, but also in our interaction with culture, which is the place of single celibacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because in a sense, what Jesus is indicating here, and of course articulating perfectly in his own humanity, is that is a singleness and celibacy is a foretaste of life in the resurrection, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's living tomorrow today, which of course is actually the call of all of us is that's what being a Christian is about. It's trying to live tomorrow today. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Paul reckons that that is the preferred state, is what he says in his writings. So that's I think that's absolutely fascinating, and something really the church needs to reclaim and understand.
But at times in the past, we've overclaimed it. So
Indeed, we've
and people have read Paul as saying
both ways, don't we? It's not, it's not.
Sorry, no pun intended there.
No pun intended. No.
People have
Sorry
read.
about that.
Oh gosh, we're gonna have lots of comments. But I think it's been mistaken to read Paul as saying that marriage is a bad thing, sex is a bad thing.
Yeah,
but actually he is saying it's not just this, but also this.
Yeah.
So I mentioned Cyprian of Carthage. I mean, it is fascinating, hard to get our heads around the fact that within the patristic period, the whole question of virginity and celibacy and singleness was actually a theological point of important discussion. John Chrysostom wrote a treatise on virginity. Methodius wrote a symposium about the 12 virgins. Cyprian of Carthage, I mentioned, we shall be, or what we shall be, he says, talking about those of us who are married. You already have begun, he's writing to virgins. The glory of the resurrection you already have in this world. You pass through the world without the pollution of the world. While you remain chaste and virgins, you are equal to the angels of God. Exactly picking up Jesus' language there. I think I love this statement. A friend of mine, Annabelle Clark, who's part of a sort of a movement encouraging healthy attitudes to marriage and singleness. She says this. She is herself single, and she says this. The Bible values singleness and marriage. Single people are equally valuable and competent as married people. At the same time, God's design from the start has been for marriage to reflect his covenant relationship with the church, to be foundational society, and to be personally experienced by most people. And I just really like that, because she's saying, yes, most people in God's good plans in this creation will marry, but some will be single, and both should be valued equally.
That's brilliantly articulated, isn't it? Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, this question about like the angels. I don't know. Have we fully kind of explored that? I mean, I think that it can. Tom Wright points out this can be quite a difficult phrase, because in popular culture, we talk of the dead, or people do talk of the dead as
they're an angel in the sky now, or
on all of that. And of course, that's not what the phrase means at all.
No.
It's not talking about. It's a functional thing. It's the point here is that the angels don't marry, and the angels don't
procreate.
die.
No, they don't die.
They don't procreate. No, because there's no need for that, because they don't die. So that's what seems to be what Jesus is pointing us to in that. So single angels, as it were, are But
and in the end, all of this stuff, all this discussion about what marriage is, all our relationships, our future hope, they all do come down to recognizing that we are living in the overlap of, I was saying between the ages, we're living in the overlap of the ages. So we, as it were, have one foot in this world, and in this world we marry, procreate, have children, and so on. But we're also one foot in the age to come, and in the age to come, we are like the angels. And I think there's also, for me, I don't know if we've mentioned this in our discussion, there's a parallel here with our attitude to food.
Yeah.
Because in this age, we need to eat to sustain ourselves, to sustain our bodies. So we do, and we receive the good gifts of God, the good things, the good, sensual, enjoyable, tasty, celebrating, feasty things on the one hand. On the other hand, we know that this isn't all there is to the world. We're not just going to sort of eat, drink for tomorrow we die, but actually that's why fasting has been a regular Christian discipline, because it anticipates the world to come where we will not eat to sustain life. So the two things seem to correlate to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite difficult to get your head around this idea of living now as if the age to come has already arrived, but having to deal with the realities of this age. But this is in a sense, this is the difficult and awkward place in which Jesus calls us to live, isn't it? And it's awkward, but we glimpse the joy of the resurrection, and that's the dynamic of the Christian life, the dynamic of the way of the cross. Who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. This is what Hebrews says, isn't it? And I think that's really what's going on theologically here.
Well, we've run out of time. I mean, I feel as though we've barely scratched the
Wow.
surface.
I thought we just started, actually.
I know. Well, there we have that shows you how theological Jesus is in his teaching. So, friends, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to do the 4 things. So you can subscribe, and a button will come up here as well if you want to click on subscribe, like it, share it with your friends, and do offer some comments below. I hope we haven't confused you too much. James, lovely to see you, and look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.